Okay, so hi, I'm Sarah from the University of Toronto, and today I'm excited to present some of my research. So globally, we are confronted with a significant burden of malnutrition with a high prevalence of multiple forms. And although the number of people, there we go, who face hunger and malnutrition would be expected to decline by more than half in the absence of climate change, the risk of hunger and malnutrition is actually projected to increase by 20% by 2050 due to the major threats of climate change on food and nutrition. And so we see that malnutrition and cardiometabolic diseases operate synergistically with climate change and are perpetuated by unsustainable food systems. And these challenges are deeply interconnected and reinforce each other, as you're all really well aware. So climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion are undermining food security and nutrition in many ways across all stages of the food system by disrupting agricultural activities, compromising food availability, and accessibility, and increased food waste and loss. And then in turn, our food systems are major contributors to climate change. Agricultural production is responsible for 70% of freshwater use, and our global food system is characterized by unsustainable practices and inefficiencies that are responsible for a third of global greenhouse gas emissions and a significant proportion of waste sent to landfill, global biodiversity loss, degraded soils, and land use. And so in order to determine sustainable diets, we need to consider all the different ways in which food impacts the environment across all the stages of food production and consumption, and what energy and resource inputs are required, and then the associated emissions and impacts to water, air, and soil. And previous approaches have been siloed in considering only single or a few impact categories or stages. And there's also still significant research gaps in understanding what a healthy and sustainable diet is in different regions with unique environmental contexts, including Canada. And so my research aims to evaluate the environmental impacts of foods in Canada by developing the Canadian Food Life Cycle Inventory database and creating a multidimensional index integrating nutritional quality. So taking a life cycle assessment approach, I'm evaluating a number of impacts across each stage from production to consumption. And the system boundaries account for all the different inputs and outputs and activities across the life cycle, from the primary inputs based on the decisions of the producer up until the point of consumption by the end user or consumer. And then for the geographical boundaries, data is representative of the average practices of foods consumed in Canada. So for imported products, the origin country's production practices are weighted by the volume that's imported to Canada annually. And then for timing boundaries, data is representative of the current practices wherever the data is available. And I won't go through all these different activities, but I account for all the various activities that are within each stage from production to consumption. And then also transport is modeled across the life cycle stages according to mass, distance, and modality. And then every input and output through the system is associated with a number of impacts. And then these can be quantified in a life cycle inventory, or the impacts that are shown on the right. And then these are further quantified and classified into categories. So in addition to the overall environmental burden, I present the impacts for 4 key impact categories for each food. So once we have the life cycle inventory of an individual food, we determine the environmental impacts within 1 of 4 broad categories, and then model the final scores for each category, and then also the overall environmental burden. And then this is just a simplification, but there's some intermediate modeling steps as well. And then to account for the nutritional functionality of foods, the environmental impact score is integrated with Nutri-Score, which is a validated nutrient profiling tool. So Nutri-Score takes into account favorable components and unfavorable components, or nutrients of concern. And then the environmental impact score nutrition is modeled as a ratio of the environmental scores or impact scores of foods to the Nutri-Score. So moving on to results. So here's a graph demonstrating the environmental impacts per 100-gram portions of foods for a selection of foods. So the 4 different impact categories are shown there in the bars. And then here I've color-coded the foods based on different categories. So the red and orange are animal-based foods, and then green are plant-based foods. And again, this is for 100-gram portions. But results demonstrate that the greatest environmental impacts are generally for animal-based foods, particularly beef, which is in agreement with the current literature. And then when we look at foods, the impacts of foods per serving, so the specific serving amount that foods are consumed in, we see this comparison and the general trend between animal and plant-based foods becomes more pronounced. And then now incorporating the nutritional quality on the x-axis. So we have the most nutritious foods on the left and the less nutritious foods on the right. And then on the y-axis, the environmental impact. Oops. And we can observe a general trend where the foods that have the greater nutritional quality on the left also demonstrate lower environmental impact. So for example, bottom left corner with soy milk. And then in conclusion, our preliminary results demonstrate the potential for these tools to support researchers and policymakers and consumers in making informed decisions and driving efficient food and climate change or solutions within the Canadian context. Thank you very much.